perfect. We are live. My name is Kyle Megatelli. I am the webinar and social media coordinator for the Student Doctor Network. And today we're very happy to be joined by Michael Johnson, the managing attorney of Michael Johnson Legal, for our physician contract webinar. Michael, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here to talk with folks before they even get into medical school or in medical school. Like, try to start talking about physician contract stuff early. I'm excited.
Yeah, that's a positive, and I'm glad you say it before, because my friends who've gone through medical school said, yeah, I didn't learn a thing about what I was supposed to do. So this will be a nice, informative topic, and we can all take away something that'll save us or make us a lot of money in the future.
That's what I'm here for.
Awesome. So before we get going with the questions, I wanted to do a quick resources presentation on Student Doctor Network. So SDN is a nonprofit focused on providing free resources to both pre-health students, healthcare students, and we have a community. We're best known for our forums full of attendings, and basically hop on there. Don't listen to me. Go to our website, studentdoctor.net. There will be a resources tab at the top. The best thing you can do is just poke around and find out things for yourself. Our communities, if you're watching this, you're probably focused on medicine. And we have our physician and resident communities. You can get on there for residents, specialized forums for ERAS, SOAP, NRMP, match-related questions. If you need to swap a residency, there are people that do that on there. And there are opportunities for internships, residencies, fellowship positions. You can find a lot of really great professional resources and networking opportunities on there. So our YouTube channel, get on there if you want to learn more about a medical specialty. We have a variety of Ask Me Anything webinars with providers. Highlighted here is our locums webinar. Do you like to travel? Locums is a good way to do that. If you're facing problems in your residency program, we have our Ask Me Anything with Greg Kerr, a residency attorney, as well as an anesthesiology webinar with Dr. Chris Choukalis, who is an academic and an intensive care anesthesiologist. So just a wide variety of things. That's 3 of many. Interview feedback and school reviews. If you're getting ready for your med school interviews, hop on here. Find out what other people were asked in their interviews. It is school by school. The things that are in there aren't just interview questions we plugged in. It's literally questions that people reported. I was asked this in my interview. Med school app cost calculator. I don't want to think about how much it's going to cost to apply to med school, but I have to. So you student doctors, cost calculator, make your life a little easier so you're not blindsided by what that bill is going to be. How to choose a medical specialty. This quiz will help you assess. I mean, of course, if you're not already there, you're not going to know what you're going to end up doing, but this is a great way to kind of dial in on like, hey, what do I like? What's my personality? What might be a good fit for me? Apparently, the last slide is supposed to be our social media, and it is blank. It turns out I don't know what I'm doing with PowerPoint. Please follow us on Instagram, Student Doctor Network. And the reason I say Instagram is because Twitter and Facebook are basically imploding. So, all right, I'm giving up on that one. Michael, please tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, thank you. I got so many cool ideas from that presentation. One, I've watched the presentation with Greg Kerr, the resident attorney. Awesome. And that was really insightful. I thought he had some great advice. So if folks haven't listened to that one, definitely go check it out. I thought it was really exceptional. But yeah, so we're here to talk about physician contracts. Yeah, so maybe do a little introduction about me, talk about why I'm here and what we're doing. So I'm a physician contract lawyer. I represent physicians in evaluating, negotiating, and enforcing, the fun part, enforcing physician contracts. I got into it through my wife. I met my wife a week before Match in 2016 and literally knew nothing about physicians and their experiences, but we went through it all together, and I figured out I had to learn a little bit about physician contracts as a lawyer. And through our own experiences and education and helping out her friends, it grew to be a passion for me. So now the vast majority of my practice is helping physicians evaluate, negotiate, and enforce contracts. And I do it across all specialties and across the country.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're going to kick it off then. And if you guys have questions, put them in the comments, please, so we can get to them. All right. Before I sign my first employment contract, what should I do?
Yeah. So one of the first questions that I ask is, what do you want life to look like? These physician employment contracts are not like little click-through things that don't really matter. You know, they're not like end-user agreements on a website that are just not negotiable and you just check the box and you move on. There's a ton of really important information in your physician employment contract that's going to have a huge impact on your life. It's going to determine how and when and where you can practice and how you can change jobs, if you can change jobs. There's just tons of restrictions on your like free movement of people and capital. So we want to understand what physician contracts are, what are the primary issues, some of the primary pitfalls, and make sure we go in eyes wide open. This is a tool that you guys can use to improve your life, to work towards the lifestyle that you want. No two physician contracts are evaluated the same. If I have the same contract, and if Kyle, I'm doing it for you versus my wife, I'm going to read it very differently. I'm going to highlight different things, and different things will be important between the two of you. So it's a very personal experience, and I encourage folks to see it through that lens. There's a lot to learn. I have a bunch of resources that I put up on Instagram and I put up on social media, on my website, physiciancontracts.com. There's not a lot out there for you guys in residency to train you on physician contracts, employment contracts, what that means for you. So I'm hoping to bridge that gap a little bit. But I would say, after thinking of it through the lens of, okay, how does this fit into my life? Am I able to execute my life plan through this contract? Is that helpful to me, or does it not really fit in my life? The second question I would ask is, how do I get out? I would encourage you to not get into an employment contract without knowing exactly how you're going to get out. This is probably one of the biggest mistakes that first contract physicians make. They see the very shiny and exciting signing bonus that might be super big, and it might be equivalent to all the compensation they made in the last year of residency. Like, it can be quite substantial. And also, your bump in compensation from residency to post-training life is likely to be quite substantial. But what's often missed there is all of the things that restrict your ability to leave easily. There's compensation clawback issues. Some of these contracts require you to waive future compensation, maybe even give back a portion of that signing bonus, that training stipend, that student loan assistance, whatever it is, that sort of thing. There's non-competes or non-solicits. We'll probably touch on the vast majority of those here. Termination clauses. You can't just leave your physician job like you could like a lifeguarding summer lifeguarding gig. Often it requires 90 to 180 days of notice. You got to keep working. Some physician contracts even require you to stay, even if you're unhappy, for a couple years. So you want to really understand how it restricts your life, how you can get out. Obviously, you want to understand about compensation and what the obligations are that match, that sort of thing. But understanding how you can get out is very important. And I'd say maybe the third piece is understanding the student loans. Like, many of y'all will graduate with some pretty substantial student loan burdens. There are ways to pay that off. Some employers offer student loan stipends, like very specific portions of your salary that are like geared towards helping you pay off your student loans. Those can be very helpful. Those are negotiable. But one of the main drivers is public service loan forgiveness. A lot of my clients are looking at public service loan forgiveness. If you have a big student loan burden, then you're going to want to evaluate whether public service loan forgiveness is right for you.
Okay, perfect. So Have a life plan. All right, that's a good place to start.
Life plan, exit, and handling your student loans. That's the too long didn't listen, Michael.
All right, understood. Perfect. Well, next question. What are the most common ways a physician will be sued by the employer? That's not very fun to think about.
Yeah. It's really that exit piece, the termination clauses. Violating the termination clauses is probably the most likely reason y'all might call me 10 or 15 years from now trying to defend a lawsuit from your employer. They often require you or the employer to give 90 to 180 days of notice under a without cause termination. Or sometimes the physician or the employer can terminate the contract with cause, like immediately or upon 30 days of notice. But often those term and termination clauses in physician contracts span several pages. There's just a ton in there. Ton of ways of messing that up. So as a physician, before you get into your first contract, obviously know how you can get out. But like once you're in, when you're transitioning, you likely need some help, especially if there's anything maybe a little frustrating, a little troubling with your employment. You'll probably need some help getting out. So during the exit is when I see it the most. Sometimes with the non-compete and the non-solicit, the non-compete speaks to the geographic region where you can practice after the job ends. It usually applies when you're in the job as well, but the real meat of that clause is that it's enforceable after the contract ends. So a typical one, let's say Milwaukee area, would be 2 years and 20 miles. So wherever you're practicing, and sometimes it can be a multiple location non-compete. You can actually have to draw multiple bubbles on a map. That's a real bummer. We want to try to avoid that. But sometimes it can be a pretty big geographic region that you can't practice. So now you got to look outside that bubble and try to figure it out. Some physicians and some employers will violate that, and then they get hit with the lawsuit, or they fight a battle on the front end. I sent a demand letter today about that, actually, for a physician trying to hopefully come to an agreement with their prior employer about working in a way that might technically violate the non-compete. So those are super powerful. If they're too punitive, then they can maybe just make you leave town. Like sometimes they're just so big, like the bubble's so large and so punitive that you might have to leave, and that's too big of a risk factor. So that's one of the things we want to evaluate on the front end and try to avoid. Also, the non-solicit clause. Solicitation clauses speak to what happens when the physician leaves the employment, but then asks either the patients to come with them or the coworkers to come with them. Most contracts forbid that. They say, look, if you leave the job, your patients stay with us, or at least you can't reach out directly and try to sell your services to them or tell them, hey, come see me down the road here. But they often also apply to staff. And staffing is really hard in healthcare right now. I don't know if anybody's paying attention, but staffing out a company, especially a small business, a small practice, can be really, really hard. So if you have valuable staff that you work with, often physicians want to take them. And that's sometimes a central piece of their exit strategy. But that often violates the non-compete and non-solicit clauses, the restrictive covenants. So those are probably the two most likely. Yeah, I would say so.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to think about. So to dovetail on that one, and we got into it a little bit, but all right, how do I deal with that non-compete or that non-solicit clause in the contract? Because, maybe I don't want to uproot my life and move to Bismarck to be able to practice.
Bismarck can be beautiful, I guess. I don't know. Sorry for folks that are local to Bismarck. We're knocking on y'all. But look, the non-compete and the non-solicit can have a huge impact on your exit strategy. Now remember, before you get into your first physician contract, you got to know exactly how you can get out. That includes mapping out the non-compete, understanding what the non-solicit says, what it means, and understanding what is your next best option. So even if you sign a contract that has a punitive non-compete or non-solicit clause, if you have a very specific plan of how you're going to handle that, if there are viable alternative employment options outside of that non-compete, it's really not that big of a deal for you, then I would say go for it. Don't worry about the non-compete. But if you live like super close to where you work and the restrictive bubble is really, really wide, then that can be really challenging. You might want to try to negotiate that. So there's tons of ways to try to negotiate a non-compete on the front end. It's incredibly hard once you've already signed your first contract to ever negotiate for a better exit strategy. Like once you're in a job, like an employer might want to pay you more or less, or might want to change your obligations, or, you know, do those things, but they really don't want to make it easier for you to leave. They don't want you to like be able to develop valuable skills and be super profitable, valuable as a physician, and then make it easier for you to take that value to another employer. They don't want that. That's why they have non-competes and non-solicits, and it's almost never going to get better than whatever it is in your first contract. So if you can focus on negotiating your exit strategy in your first contract, that can be super powerful for you, particularly in future negotiations regarding compensation and obligations. That can be super powerful. So if you're on the front end, though, if you're going to negotiate your non-compete, we might get into the weeds here a little bit, Kyle.
All right.
So this is like a passion area for me. I like this area. So the non-competes are generally based on geography, like the region, the location of where the bubble is, if it's multiple bubbles or if it's a one location bubble, location, geography, and time. Time is usually in the 2-year range. Sometimes it could be 18 months or 12 months or even shorter than that. I see some that are 36 months. There are a lot of cases in many states. It's not uniform. Okay. Every state's a little bit different on their non-compete laws, but usually it's like a 2 years, and then it depends on how rural or urban it is, whether a 10-mile non-compete or a 5-mile non-compete is more common versus, you know, a 35-mile. I saw one 110 miles. I saw one 250. That was outside of medicine, but 100, 110 in a very rural area for a specialist is entirely possible. So if you're under one of those, like, you got to leave town if you want a different job. But you can try to negotiate any one of those three or some combo of those three. Like if instead of 25 miles, you can ask your employer to reduce it to 17 because there's 2 employers that, you know, are 18 and 19 miles outside of the bubble. That can be super helpful. You can also ask for some sunrise clauses where they don't apply until you've been there for like 6 months. So if you really don't like the job, like very early on, you can get out and you won't be subject to the non-compete. I've seen that a couple times. I'll also see some sunset clauses that say, hey, look, after a certain number of years, employer, you've earned your money back. Like that initial investment that you made in me to build up my practice, you benefited enough. So now you shouldn't be able to restrict my exit as much. So maybe 5, 8 years down the road, 10 years down the road, you can negotiate for that non-compete to go from 2 years, 25 miles to 2 years, 10 miles. There's so many different ways to negotiate non-competes. I don't think everyone needs to like become masters at non-compete negotiation right now, but like make sure that you understand it when the time comes.
Yeah, what I heard was just retain counsel. There's a good reason why people in your seat are the ones who are experts on this. Okay. Hey, guys watching, get your comments in so we can get those answered. And here's one from Emil Chuck. How important are letters of recommendation to getting hired?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that comes in usually before I'm involved, before I'm negotiating the contract. I would imagine having strong letters of recommendation and being like very organized with your application process and like demonstrating you're a professional from stem to stern can be very helpful. Like if an employer is getting a couple physicians interested in a particular job, having your letters of recommendation in on time and making sure everything is nice and tight and appropriate can help give you leverage to negotiate. They might want you more, and if the employer wants you more, then that's good for me, because then I get to like help you ask for more and figure out a way to leverage that to your advantage. So I would say, I don't know that I have specific advice on what should go into your letter of recommendation, but I would say your overall package, how you present to the employer throughout the interview process, can add value to you, can actually end up helping you get a better non-compete clause or a better non-solicit, or maybe negotiating for a little bit more compensation, maybe, or adding something important in your contract because they want you more than the other person because you've been more professional during that process. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, being professional, that never not good advice right there.
No.
So another question we got here from Hope Medical Institute. Can you briefly walk us through the J1 process, Canada et al.?
Yeah, so I get a lot of questions about J1s. The challenge with J1s is that when you find an employer that's willing to sponsor your J1 visa, you're probably signing on for 3 years, and it's really challenging to get out for that 3-year period. After that 3-year period of working for a J1 sponsored employer, then you have more freedom to exit that job and to move around. So if I'm representing someone that needs a J1 visa, we want to be very careful with that employment contract. We want to start way out in advance, okay? Normally, I recommend physicians to start in that like 12 months out range, start in the interview process. You can start a couple months early, you can start a couple months later, but non-J1 physicians, folks coming out of residency, have the option of like starting now and kind of scrambling through. Okay, we can talk about that whole process later. But if you're going for a J1, I really want you to start like springtime, even like 15 months, 18 months in advance. Make sure you really vet those employers really, really early on. Make sure you look very closely during the interview process. Talk maybe a little bit more in depth with the physicians that are in that practice. Get a feel for what they're going to do with you during those 3 years. Can't really leave. Can be really stressful. So if that employer decides to maybe try to flip the deal on you a little bit and not really treat you fairly, it can be quite painful to exit. So I would start early. Often the employer will do the heavy lifting on the immigration side. Sorry for folks who don't know what we're talking about yet. J1 speaks to folks from outside of the country that came in, did a residency program, and instead of returning to their home country, they're going to stay here and continue working for a qualifying employer here in the U.S. And then afterwards, usually ends up leading towards a green card, towards citizenship. Okay. So then, where was I? So during that process, when you're vetting the contract, you're vetting the employer, you want to pay really close attention to the obligations of the job. If that job reads like, we pay you some money and you do whatever we feel like telling you to do each day, that's a huge risk factor for folks in the J1 process, because they can't really leave. Like if you have a contract like that, I don't encourage you to have that, but if you have one like that and you can leave at any moment and your employer knows like, hey, even though the contract says it's pretty loose, I have to treat them fairly because they're just going to leave if I treat them unfairly, then the physician has leverage. But a J1 holder kind of loses a little bit of that leverage during that 3-year period. So we want to tighten up if we can. We want to tighten up what the job obligations are. For example, if you're outpatient psychiatry, I want to know how many patient contact hours you're required to give. Give me a number. You got to put it in the contract. No, like 40 hours plus any other time as may be needed by the employer in the sole discretion. None of that nonsense language. Like, we got to tighten up your obligations. Compensation piece, like you're probably going to be okay. the odds of them just not paying you what is owed is unlikely, I think. A lot of J1 sponsored employers are larger employers that are probably unlikely to just decide to unilaterally change it in a super drastic way on short notice. But they might take advantage of you with obligations. So, yeah.
Okay. Follow-up question on that one. Are employers obligated to pay for J1 and H1 visa employment sponsorship? I'm sorry.
Sponsorship.
I can read one.
Are they obligated? That's a good question. So I do have other folks that I'll refer clients out to when they get really deep into the J1 and H1B visa process. I'm not an immigration lawyer, but I do see it from the physician employment contract side. So it's actually be a great partnership with another lawyer one day to be able to partner with them for this type of process. What I'm seeing in practice is that the employers do pay for it. I don't know if they have a legal obligation to pay for it. I can follow up on that.
All right, cool. So next question. If I want to moonlight in residency, what do I need to be aware of to ensure I'm not violating the terms of my employment contract?
Yeah, so if you go to a residency that allows moonlighting, that can be super helpful, financially, right? Maybe factor that into where you go to residency. It was super helpful. My wife's a psychiatrist, and her residency program did allow it. I think after year 1 or year 2. I think the first couple of years you couldn't, or you could only moonlight intern. I couldn't remember exactly, but this was one of my first intros into physician contracts. Was looking at her first contract. And some of the moonlighting contracts that you're offered in residency might have a ton of nonsense in them. You're going to want to look at the term and termination clauses. It's a really good exercise to say, okay, I'm going to leave this contract. This is a moonlighting contract in residency. It's not meant to last for the next 30 years. It's meant to last probably for months, maybe a couple years if you and the employer are lucky to find a perfect fit. So you really want to know how to get out of it. An important piece is the malpractice tail. Malpractice tail, everyone knows what malpractice is. I think most people figure out you got to get malpractice insurance to cover any exposures related to committing malpractice. Okay. But there's a separate insurance policy that you often need to purchase or make sure is included in your contract for claims that arise after you leave the job. Okay. So your contract really needs to speak very directly to whether you have malpractice tail and malpractice insurance actually covered through that job, through that employer, or if you need to purchase it separately. If you need to purchase it separately, you need to get some quotes on the front end and figure out how much it's going to cost you and figure out okay, is this job really worth it? If they're not paying me very much, but then at the end of this, I got to go buy an insurance policy that costs me, I don't know, a couple or few $1,000s, maybe more, depending on the type of work that you're doing. If they're putting that exposure on you, then you got to factor that in and make sure that they're paying you enough and that you're saving enough on the side to pay that when you exit. I see that quite often, more often than you think, for clients of mine that are looking to sign their first contract. Often your first employment contract after you finish residency or fellowship, whatever you're doing, requires you to warrant, to promise that you have no exposed malpractice tail issues prior to signing that contract. And if you moonlighted during residency or fellowship, then you might actually be violating your first employment contract before you even get there if you don't buy malpractice tail to cover that exposure. So before you get into a moonlighting contract during residency, you want to make sure you can get out super easy, termination clauses, that sort of thing. Okay. But number two, make sure you understand very clearly whether the employer is buying your tail or if you have to purchase it. Let me think, what else? Make sure I'm not violating the terms of my employment contract. Obviously, make sure your residency allows it. Don't do that. That could be painful. and make sure that whatever the terms of your moonlighting clause are don't violate any requirements to be working for your residency program at the time. Like you don't want to be out there breaching residency, breaching moonlighting contracts and putting residency programs, have them come at you. That might be a Greg Care question. But yeah, I guess that's it.
I don't think it can be stressed enough, guys. Lawyer up. Do not try to do this on your own if you are not an attorney. Jeez. So next question. To dovetail here, what does the tail part of malpractice insurance mean?
Yeah, super easy. So during your employment, the policy that's going to cover you is your malpractice insurance policy. Okay. After you finish the job, after you leave that job, there's often a second policy that needs to be purchased for malpractice claims that are made outside of the employment term. So that can get a little confusing. So some employers will purchase their malpractice insurance on an occurrence base, and some will purchase it on a claims made base. Occurrence based usually means that the employer is buying your tail. They're actually paying for it up front. They're paying for all claims of malpractice that arise, that occur during your employment. The claims made policy pays for claims that are made, not when it occurs, not when the thing happened, but only claims that are made during a specific time period. And then if you're outside of that time period, then there's no coverage for the malpractice claim. You really don't want to get hit with an uncovered malpractice claim, particularly during residency or really at any time, obviously. But that's the long and short of tail.
Okay, cool. So we have another question here from Laura Turner. What are your thoughts on incorporated documents, external reports that apply to your contract?
Yeah. So this is really great. So when I get a contract to review, usually the first thing that I do is I request all of the documents that are referenced in your physician employment contract, but are not given to you. Like usually there's an employee handbook or some sort of employee policies and procedures that might have some important information about the job. I see some employers sticking some really important information like the term and termination clauses or the non-solicit clause in the employee handbook, and they didn't even give you the handbook before you sign the contract. Like that, to me, that's nonsense. But it happens all the time. There's often an external document that speaks to the compensation plan. A lot of physicians will have a contract that reads that your compensation is guaranteed to a certain minimum for the first 12 to 36 months. And then after that protective period, you move on to production. And often your contract will read your compensation under the productivity model will be the then existing compensation plan for similarly situated physicians. And they don't give you like the current plan. Like, what is the current plan? I don't know. You didn't tell me. Like, I have no idea how much you're going to be compensated in year 2 or year 3 after you roll off that protective period, because you don't even have a document that speaks to it in your contract. The contract references it. It says that you got to follow this external document, but you've never seen it. You've never read it. So I'm not a big fan of like agreeing to things you don't know about. Like that's kind of part of being a lawyer, right? So we want to ask for all of those and investigate, okay, what other promises do I have to keep that I don't even know about yet?
Okay, that is a lot to think about right there.
Pretty heavy, right?
Again, this is why you get a lawyer, so you don't get it dumped on you like, oh, I didn't maximize billing and now I'm not going to get paid as much.
There's a quick plug on that. Like, I don't want everyone to walk away thinking, oh, I can't do anything. I got to hire a lawyer for everything. No, y'all need to know about these things. You got to learn about it. You got to incorporate it into your life and know when you need to hire a lawyer. But if you're going to medical school, you go into residency, you're going to finish your training. You're going to get a job that's going to pay you quite nicely. You're going to have big exposures probably from student loans, but you also have huge opportunities. Like you're going to eventually have a pretty sizable shovel, and it's going to have a bunch of money in it. So like when you're in that situation, you need a team around you. You need folks to help you out. It's just too challenging to be an expert in all of these fields. You'll probably need to learn a little bit about personal finance. That can be super helpful. Yeah. You'll need to learn about physician contracting, how all these contracts can have a huge impact on like mapping out the life that you want. And then use those to your advantage and then know, okay, now's the time that I need help. Now's the time that I need to reach out to my team and make sure we do this right. Learning how to do that when you need help can be incredibly valuable for physicians.
Awesome. So to go back to that tail part again, what is the usual statute for tail coverage?
The usual statute. So statute usually speaks to like a law in like each state passes laws about various things. Statute might also mean like a section of the contract. There's usually some section of the contract that speaks to professional liability. Sometimes it says malpractice coverage. Sometimes it says professional liability. Sometimes it just says like insurance coverage. But it's usually in the contract. And if it's not, you better ask for it and understand. Like if there's nothing that speaks to like professional liability in your employment contract, like, whoo, that's a big red flag. At least needs to have that section in it. So I guess usual statute, like there are some states that will allow for certain entities in that state to have immunity from malpractice claims. Like sometimes they'll make malpractice claims unenforceable against certain like higher risk, smaller community hospitals, that sort of thing. Really just depends. So if you want to like maybe update that question, we're getting some great ones from Hope Medical right now. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, keep the questions coming. Thank you guys. And oh man, yeah, you got to read everything that you're given. You know, if it isn't there in black and white, it doesn't actually exist. So here's a fun one. How do I negotiate for more compensation? I'll say everything's going great. I haven't been sued or fired. I haven't violated my contract that I read in its entirety. How do I negotiate for more compensation?
Yeah, so you negotiate for more compensation by understanding your value and then mapping out such that you can take that value somewhere else, that you can leave. A lot of the physician employment contracts will try to restrict your ability to exit. Kyle, you're probably picking up on a theme, right? Like it told me to talk about compensation, and now we're talking about exit strategy. Like that's the thing that's going to restrict your ability to make more in the future. Like when you're coming out of residency, you have all of the promise, right? Like you're the prince, you're the princess, like the future is going to be great, all of that. Okay. And they hire you based on the hopes that you're going to be super valuable and you're going to be able to serve their patients really well. And you're going to be able to do it very efficiently. And you're going to be frankly, profitable. Now, if you are profitable, they want to hold on to you. They don't want you to go anywhere else. They don't want other employers to take their good choice, you know, their successful draft pick, if you will. They don't want to be able. They don't want other employers to take you away. So if you can protect your right to exit in your first contract, then negotiating compensation in the future actually gets easier. Often negotiating compensation takes many forms. So like in the hypo, when we're talking about the J1, how we want to clearly identify obligations. A way to negotiate for more compensation is say, okay, employer, you want to pay me X. Maybe you're on a base salary model and all you want to pay me is this number. I'm going to make more if I have control over my obligations such that you can't abuse me. You can't add in more patients and more time and more call and more weekends and more nights and more holidays. You can't do all of this because my contract is stronger. So I actually have control over the obligations. I work less for the same compensation. That's negotiating for more compensation because you're making more per unit of time. I call that more compensation. The overall number stays the same. Yeah. But if what you're required to do is a little bit more restricted, then that can be super successful. And I say that like not to encourage physicians to like be like lazy. That's not what we're doing. You guys are not lazy. Like y'all work so hard, and frankly, employers know that and often take advantage of you. So one of the biggest ways that I can protect you guys in negotiating compensation is actually on the obligations side. Now, let's talk about actually negotiating compensation, right? Talked about negotiating everything else except for compensation, but let's talk about that. So with your first contract, your leverage often depends on geography. Geographic arbitrage is super powerful for negotiating compensation. If you want to live in the most attractive metro markets, you want to live in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, San Francisco, Seattle, San Diego, it can be really hard to negotiate for more compensation. Often a bunch of physicians want that job that you're trying to get. So if an employer, think about it from supply and demand, just basic economics from back in high school. If the supply of physicians is really high and the number of jobs is lower than that, then the employer doesn't have to give you more compensation to take the job because they can offer it to the next person. Okay? In this country, we don't have enough physicians, but in certain markets, we're actually oversaturated. Like it's not evenly spread out through the entire country. So, for example, if you're a psychiatrist, you want to go to central Wisconsin, compensation is going to be really nice. But if you want to be, I don't know, San Diego, Seattle, then it's going to be less. Like you want to be in, western Nebraska, then compensation is going to be really high. That's a way to negotiate for more compensation. When you see like the MGMA percentiles, like the national like aggregated data on physician compensation, that's one of the huge drivers of whether you're like on the higher end or the lower end of those percentiles is where you're willing to go to work. Negotiating for more compensation can also take the form of making sure you pick a PSLF eligible employer and you pursue the program. If you come out like us with, $400K in student loans, you can get through that. It's a lot easier to do it with PSLF, in my opinion. And PSLF forgiveness is an untaxed event. And when you become a physician, you start making 200, 300, 400K or more, your tax burden is going to explode very aggressively. Like that last bit of compensation that you make is probably taxed at 40 or 50% overall, maybe even a little higher in higher state tax states like California. There's a state tax issue piece to it. But if you're looking at that piece, PSLF can be super powerful for your compensation, because if you get forgiveness on $400,000 in student loans, well, it would have probably taken almost twice that to pay it off with post-tax earnings. So that forgiveness is now worth $700,000, and it's going to come anywhere from 7 years after training for like the shorter training periods, like ED and family, that sort of thing. But like if you're in a longer training period, let's say you're a more highly specialized surgeon, you might only have a couple years left. So now you're looking at it's like, okay, I got 400 or 500K in student loans, and I'm looking at employers, and I get public service loan forgiveness if I stick around here for another, 24 months, and that forgiveness is worth $800,000. Like maybe I should just do that. So that can be super powerful for your compensation. Next, if you're looking at a job that eventually you're going to be paid on production, then you're going to want to look at the value per unit of production that employer is paying. That's not the same across the board. It's usually measured in an RVU. You'll probably don't need to know that right this moment, but you will know that. You'll know what that means in the future, because that's going to be tied to your compensation. But understanding what your employer is paying per RVU for your job, and then comparing that across employers, is a very easy way to learn who's paying what and to negotiate for more. Say, hey, so-and-so is paying $60 instead of $45. Are you willing to come up? That sort of thing. And obviously there's not obviously, I guess, for you guys, but there's so many other like components to your compensation. You have potentially signing bonuses, training stipends, student loan payments, productivity bonuses, quality metric bonuses. There's so many pieces that go into it. So a question like, how do I negotiate for more compensation? I think I've been going at this for what, like 7 minutes? Way too long, but there's so much into it. So I would say understanding all of that first, understanding where the pressure points are, and then using other offers, using your knowledge of the geographic region, what other employers are doing to potentially push your employer for more can be super powerful.
So start planning early, have a life plan, and start thinking about how these things might affect what you're doing in the future. I mean, I've had employment contracts before, but they're like the kids club version compared to this stuff. Man. So related to that, a couple of things you mentioned, how should loans, oh good, I put should in there twice. I thought I edited that out. How should loans and PSLF factor into picking a residency program? I'm just firing on all cylinders today.
You're good. Well, you should factor in both. We should do that. Look, so there's a handful of residency programs that are private that actually don't. That's a really good question. So let's define PSLF. PSLF stands for Public Service Loan Forgiveness. It's a government program where physicians and others that serve a nonprofit for a certain period, 120 months, can have their student loans forgiven by the government. There's a ton of requirements in this. I don't want this to like devolve into a PSLF presentation. That would be a really good one, though. Maybe you've already had that. But PSLF can be super powerful for resolving your student loans. Sometimes they can get too high where paying them off with post-tax earnings after you finish residency or in training just can be super challenging. So if you want to explore that program, if you want that to be an option to you, I would favor picking a residency program that is a nonprofit. There's a few out there that are not, and it can be a little bit challenging if like your time during training does not count towards those 120 hours.
Yeah.
The vast majority of residencies actually do. So let's say you're training and you have, let's say you're a cardiologist, 3 years and 2 years or 3 years, you're already 5-6 years in. Maybe you did a sub-fellowship, you're 7 years in through training. All of that time counts for working for a nonprofit for the 120 months because you're working probably for an academic institution that is a nonprofit. So now you only have a few years left, and that's a lot easier to stomach. We're in the program. My wife is doing it. So we're like 43, 44 months out right now. So I'm seeing a lot of folks accomplish PSLF. There's a ton that are having their loans forgiven right now. Folks who came a few years before us didn't get the best advice. It was a little bit messy. When it was first implemented, no one knew kind of exactly how it was going to work. It was more of like into Bush era, early Obama era. There's a number of other moving parts during that time that were very frustrating. And the student loan, public service loan forgiveness program wasn't spelled out great. A lot of that has changed, and the folks that are in the program now, it's a high probability that they will get the forgiveness that was promised by the program. But definitely factor that in. If you're getting into medical school and you're watching that number go way, way up over and over again, it can help kind of assuage, like ease your concerns if you understand what PSLF is, understand that is likely going to be an option to you as a physician.
Plan ahead. Man, there's a lot of planning that needs to be done if you're going down this path, it seems. Cool. So what recourse do I have if the compensation terms of my employment contract are not being upheld? This is an important one for sure.
Well, if they're not paying you what they promised in the contract to pay you, you should hire me and we should sue them. Like that can be an option. Look, disputes over compensation, I think, are quite rare with larger employers. Like I don't see that a ton, but there are some smaller private practices where maybe their compensation plan is just not super clear. Or there's just some sort of disconnect. Maybe it's clear to me or clear to the lawyers, but there's some sort of disconnect between the physician and the employer on how the compensation plan should work. If they're not being upheld, though, then you can enforce them. It's a contract. If they owe you money under the terms they're not paying you, then hire a lawyer, someone who's experienced in contracts, ideally someone who's experienced in physician contracts. And explore sending a demand letter, send some legal hate mail, or maybe sue them. Who knows? I would say compensation is probably number 3 of the ways that we would potentially end up in a lawsuit between you and your employer. 1's probably the term and termination clauses. 2 is probably the non-compete, non-solicit. And then number 3 is just a confusion, a dispute over compensation.
Okay, interesting. Guys, thank you for kicking in the questions. We're coming up on time pretty rapidly. If you have any last minute questions, throw them in the comments, please. So this is a good one. And anybody who's in my position, like applying this next cycle, don't start thinking about this yet. There's a lot of steps before you get there. But how early can I get a signing bonus?
Probably the sexiest question we have, right? So signing bonuses can be really exciting for you guys. You go into medical school, you see all of your friends in their mid-20s or maybe a little bit later that are making are like already working and starting to enjoy life a little bit, like have some money flowing, but you don't have that. Like you're going to medical school and you're pretty poor. And then you go into residency and, you're working a ton of hours, kind of an abusive number of hours sometimes. And you're still not making that much, maybe 60 to 70 grand, maybe a few bucks more than that. But it doesn't go very far. And then you start looking at jobs, and depending on your specialty, some of the signing bonuses alone could be equivalent to like 6 months or a year, or sometimes 2 years of like your residency salaries. They can be huge. I would encourage you though to not get too glossy-eyed over that signing bonus. Often signing bonuses come with strings attached. They're not paid like a football player where they just hand you money and then if you break your leg the next day you get to keep the money. Like that's not how it works. Signing bonuses are really in advance on future earnings. And they can tie you to your employer for maybe longer than you want. So let's say you're offered a $100,000 signing bonus. It'll probably cover anywhere from 2 to 5 years, such that if you get to that job and you don't like it and you want to leave after year 1 or year 2, well, now you either have to give back all of it, sometimes with interest. Often it's prorated monthly. So if you serve 2 of the 5 years, you got to pay back 60% of it. I think that math's right. But that can be super painful. Like if someone gives you a bunch of money during residency, like y'all are probably going to spend it on things that you really need. Like you probably have a broke down car, or you haven't really gone out on an expensive date with your significant other, your partner for a little while. Like you're probably going to use it for consumption. That's what they really want you to do. They want that money to be gone as quickly as possible, such that when you get into the job, and if you're unhappy with it, then you might not have that money to pay them back, pay that signing bonus back to them so you can leave. I get quite often requests like, hey, look, the signing bonus money's gone. I'm really unhappy with this job. I got to leave. What do I do? It's like, well, your options aren't great. We can like go hat in hand and beg for forgiveness, but like employers are not going to want to do that a bunch. So this can be very, very painful. If we end up in a litigated dispute over compensation, it might be related to signing bonus. Signing bonus is also more of like a termination issue as well. Like really doesn't come up as an issue unless you terminate your contract before the end of the term that is protected by the signing bonus. So it's usually one of the claims that's associated with the dispute over how you exit a job. And it can cost you a lot. So before you sign on, before you accept a job because of a huge signing bonus, I want you to think, man, why are they giving me all this money? Okay, what else is there? What's going on with the future compensation? Are they paying me $100,000 signing bonus so that they can convince me that a 2-year, 60-mile non-compete is totally cool? Well, if that's the case, like, yeah, I got $100,000, but my future negotiating leverage for compensation is now terrible. So that $100,000 is not going to help you on the macro level. Like looking at it from, 2, 5, 10 years into the future, if that signing bonus comes with other restrictive leverage and exit pieces, then it might have cost you actually a bunch of money. So the question was, how early can I get it though? Like you can probably start like exploring employment options even 2 years in advance. I get folks calling. I have a potential client, a physician who's a PGY1 now in a family practice that contacted me, I guess a month ago now, and they were offered an employment contract, and it came with a training stipend, which is just like a signing bonus. They pay you money in advance before you get there, and it attaches like once you graduate, once you finish residency, you have to work for that employer for 2 to 5 years or whatever. But they're willing to start paying them now, $1,500 a month for the remainder of residency. And the question was like, should I do this? It's like, you could, but I don't know, 2 years, 2.5 years out, do you even know what you want to do? Probably not. Like if you're in psychiatry, there's like 15 different little subspecialties that you could explore doing. I don't know that you're really equipped, 2.5, 3 years out to decide that. If you're in like a rural family practice residency, you're exposed to so many things. You could do hospitalist work, outpatient clinic work, L&D focused. There's so many different things that you can do. Like, are you ready to decide? Are you ready to like lock yourself into potentially a bad decision because of a signing bonus issue? I would try to avoid that. It's really hard for me though, because I know how little y'all make and how painful it is. But that's kind of the pull.
Yeah, think about the taxes on it as well.
Yeah.
That is not tax-free money. So, Michael, I know that I said we're coming up on time. Can we do one more question? There's one here that Hope Medical Institute brought up, and this is the one I want to know about. This is the most interesting thing I'm thinking about now. Are there whistleblower provisions in contracts? What cases have you seen? That is an awesome question.
Wow, that's a good one. How much time do we have? So let's talk about a whistleblower provision related to physician contracts specifically. Like, there's other issues, right? Let's talk about ones you might see as a physician. Stark law is an important one. If a physician is receiving funds from the DHS, from the government, from like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that sort of thing, then their compensation packages are a bit restricted. Like it's different than if you're a physician that owns like a Medi-Spa, like you can make them as much as you want. But if you accept government funds, then your compensation package has to be commercially reasonable, be based on fair market value, and cannot take into account the value of your referrals. So some of like the more specialized physicians, some of the more like highly compensated physicians, often the value of referrals is huge. But if an employer like buys out a practice, or a physician is compensated based on that extra value that they provide to an institution, to a hospital, then that can trigger some regulatory exposure. So one thing that pops up in physician world is that if there is a violation, a Stark law violation, it's usually by another physician in the practice, or sometimes it comes up during like a regulatory kind of investigation, that sort of thing. it can be challenging. Like if you are the whistleblower, it's a tough space to be in. I would say that you should do it because it's right, because it's the federal law. Like you're kind of that's the only way to enforce that law. But it can be really challenging. Like it might end up having an impact on your career, and I'm not a big fan of that. We could talk about Stark Law for the next 2 hours, but another piece, maybe a whistleblower type issue, is sharing compensation information among other physicians in your group. Can you do that? This is a really challenging thing for me to answer, because federal law does have some protections, have a lot of protections for employees that share compensation information. However, there might be times where that doesn't apply to a physician. You gotta be very careful with this. And even if it doesn't, then an employer might be interested in terminating you without cause. And then it might be challenging to say, like, yeah, they're terminating me because I was sharing compensation information that's protected under federal law, but they terminated me anyways. It might be very difficult to defend that. And also, like, protections for employees don't apply to independent contractors. A lot of physicians are actually not W-2 employees. They actually fall under separate laws for independent contractors. They're actually like their own small, like, one-person business that then contracts with a hospital or contracts with another practice or something like that. So they're not employees, and they don't have those rights to, like, share information. And it's a little bit different also maybe among partnerships, partners in practices, also sharing compensation information with employees that are outside of your employer, like employees of a different employer. That can be banned, that sort of thing. So I get that question a lot, like, can I share my compensation information? And that's really challenging to answer accurately and quickly. But yeah, I'd say those are some of the important ones that I see in physician contracting world.
Cool. Hope Medical Institute, thank you for that question. There's a lot to think about here. It's, I mean, I know where I'm at. It's just like, okay, like, don't bomb the MCAT, don't be a goof in interviews, et cetera, et cetera. But I like what you said about have a life plan, you know, like start thinking about this stuff early on. And oh man, I'm just going to stop thinking about the rest of it. Michael, thank you so much for your time and putting down this info. This is a lot, you know, there is a good reason why you're the contract lawyer and physicians don't also moonlight. Well, they probably shouldn't try to do it all themselves. I'm sure some do, but man, there's a lot of great information. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm really excited to get a chance to maybe expose folks who are just looking at medical school or just in medical school, like kind of on the front end. I really want physicians to negotiate their contracts. These aren't like click-through terms that, you know, terms of agreement that you just click through, okay? They mean something. They're important to your life. They have a huge impact on your life, your family, your kids, your relationships, your happiness, burnout, moral injury. They have a huge impact on so many important things, okay? And they're negotiable, and you should negotiate. I tried to get a hashtag going, Docs Negotiate 2023, but I guess for this, these folks, maybe it's Docs Negotiate 2033. Like, I love for the future to look really bright for physicians. I think physicians would benefit from evaluating and negotiating their contracts appropriately. And maybe like everybody, maybe healthcare would be better if physicians took back power by negotiating their contracts. We normalize all physicians negotiating their contracts, even with larger employers, even with large academic institutions, all of them. Take back that power. It might even be better for patients, for all of it. So,
yeah, best advice I got when I started my career many moons ago was everything's negotiable. But once it's in the contract and you've signed, it's a wrap, pal.
Yeah,
cool.
I agree. Thank you so much.
Yeah, again, thank you to everybody for joining us, for your questions. Have a great rest of the evening or whenever you're watching this.